My mother left everything to my brother. Not most of it. Everything. The house she had lived in for 40 years. The savings account she had built quietly over 3 decades. The investment portfolio my father had started before he died, and which she had maintained without touching for 22 years. All of it. To my brother. I sat in the attorney's office on a gray November morning and listened to the words, and I kept my face completely still, and I did not say a single thing until Gerald Forsythe finished reading, closed the folder, and looked at me with the careful neutrality of a man who has delivered this kind of news before. I did not have questions. I had one thought. She forgot something. And that something was about to change everything my brother believed he had just inherited. My name is Sarah Calloway. I am 49 years old. I grew up in Burlington, Vermont, the younger of 2 children of Margaret and Thomas Calloway. My father died when I was 26. My mother lived 23 more years after that, in the same house, with the same routines, the same quiet certainty about how things should be done and who should do them. I am a high school English teacher. I have taught at the same school for 19 years. I live 12 minutes from where I grew up, which is not an accident. My brother James is 4 years older than me. He lives in Phoenix, Arizona, running a landscaping business that is, by his own account, always either breaking through or falling apart, depending on the day. James called our mother every Sunday. I drove to her house every Tuesday and Thursday without being asked. That is the whole arithmetic of it, really. Everything else in this story is just what that arithmetic eventually produced. Stay with me. My mother told me once, about 6 years before she died, that she had always found James easier, not better. She was careful about that word. Not better. Easier. She said, "He doesn't complicate things the way you do, Sarah. He takes things as they are." I said, "I take things as they are." She gave me the look she reserved for statements she found both wrong and not worth arguing about. She said, "You think about things too much. James just moves forward." I thought about that conversation for years. I thought about it while driving her to cardiologist appointments, while organizing her medications into a pill box she could never quite manage herself, while sitting alone in the waiting room during her hip surgery because James had a work commitment he could not reschedule, and sent flowers instead. James moved forward. I thought about things too much. I spent years wondering if those two things were actually different, or if they just looked different, depending on which direction you were standing. The last 3 years of my mother's life were the most demanding. Not dramatically. The slow, accumulating kind that does not announce itself, but which you notice one day has consumed most of the available space in your life. She needed more help with the house, the appointments, the paperwork, the insurance forms, the prescription refills, the calls to the bank when something came through that frightened her more than she would admit. I did all of it. Not entirely alone. James sent money when I asked directly, and came for Christmas and her birthday, genuinely warm when he was present. I do not want to make him a villain, because he is not quite one. He built a life far away, and decided, without quite saying so, that distance was a legitimate substitute for presence. It is not. But I understood the decision. I had made a different one, partly by choice, partly because I never felt the pull to leave the way he had. I was built for the kind of love that shows up on Tuesdays and Thursdays without being asked. What I was not built for was discovering that the love you show up for does not always appear where you expect to find it. My mother updated her will 8 months before she died. I did not know this until Gerald Forsythe told me in his office. She had gone alone on a Tuesday morning in March and made changes she never mentioned on any of the Tuesdays and Thursdays afterward, when I sat in her kitchen drinking her too strong coffee and talking about ordinary things. I have thought about why, many times. The generous interpretation is that she did not want the conversation, that she knew I would not simply accept it the way James would, and lacked the energy, in her last year, for what would follow. The less generous interpretation I keep to myself, because it does not help me. And some questions about the people we love are better carried quietly than answered loudly. James flew in for the will reading. He arrived tired and genuinely grieved, the way he always was during the times he was actually present. My brother's grief was real. He just loved her from a distance, and assumed the distance had been forgiven completely. Maybe it had. Maybe that was part of what the will was saying. We had dinner the night before, just the two of us at the kitchen table of the house that was about to become his, sharing the memories that were safe and avoiding the ones that were not. I had no idea then what was actually coming. Gerald read the will in the order estate attorneys always do. Personal items first, then property, then accounts. The personal items were distributed with precision. Certain jewelry to certain people. My father's watch to James, a brooch that belonged to her mother, to me. Then Gerald came to the estate. The house, to James. The savings account, to James. The investment portfolio, to James. I kept my face still. Across the table, James was quiet, in a way that did not quite look like surprise. Gerald closed the folder, looked at me, said, "Are there any questions?" I said, "Just one. Is that the complete document?" Gerald looked at me a moment longer than the question required. Then he said, "There is one additional item I need to address." James looked up. I looked at Gerald. He opened a second folder. My maternal grandmother had established a small trust in 1989, created to pass certain assets outside the standard estate process. It named my mother as primary trustee and beneficiary, and a contingent beneficiary who would receive the assets if my mother died first. Gerald read the contingent beneficiary's name. "It was mine," James said. "What is in the trust?" "It was not a fortune. I want to be clear about that, because this story isn't about a fortune. It was a modest sum, the kind that doesn't change a life dramatically, but says something significant about the person who set it aside." Alongside the trust documents was a letter, in my grandmother's handwriting, dated 1989. Gerald asked if I wanted him to read it, or read it privately. I said, "Please read it." My grandmother had written 3 paragraphs. The first explained the trust. Practical, clear, the language of a woman who never left important things to assumption. The second was addressed to my mother. She wrote, "Margaret, I have watched how you love your children, and I have noticed something you may not have noticed yourself. You love them both. But you see Sarah the way you see yourself, as someone who will be fine regardless. I am asking you to see her the way I see her, as someone who shows up, not because she has to, because it is who she is." The room was very quiet. The third paragraph. She wrote, "Sarah, if you are reading this, then the trust has found its way to you the way I intended. I want you to know that your grandmother saw you. Every Tuesday, every Thursday, every time you showed up without being asked. I did not always have the words to say this when I was alive. I hope this is enough." Gerald folded the letter and placed it on the table in front of me. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Then James said, very quietly, "Grandma always paid attention." I said, "Yes, she did." He looked at the table, then at me. He said, "Sarah, I didn't know about the will. I want you to know I didn't know." I believed him. Not because he is incapable of pretending otherwise, but because the look on his face was the look of someone receiving information, not managing its delivery. I said, "I know you didn't." He said, "I don't know what to say." I said, "You don't have to say anything right now." He said, "It's not fair." I said, "No, it isn't." He said, "What are you going to do?" That was the question. I had a trust that was legally mine, a letter from my grandmother explaining why, and a brother who had just inherited everything our mother spent 40 years building, and a decision to make, not about the money, about what kind of person I was going to be on the other side of this. I took 3 weeks. My closest friend Patrice told me, "Whatever you decide, make sure you can live with it at 70, not at 49. My therapist asked, "What does keeping it make possible? And what does sharing it make possible?" And which of those matters more to you? I called James on a Sunday morning. He answered on the first ring, which told me he'd been waiting. I said, I have made a decision. He said, tell me. I said, I am keeping the trust. Every dollar of it. He was quiet. I said, not because I'm angry, not because I want to punish anyone, because it was given to me by someone who saw what I did and chose to acknowledge it. Splitting it because it's easier, because it reduces conflict, would be a way of saying her intention didn't matter. He said, I understand. I said, but I'm not going to carry this. I'm not going to spend the rest of my relationship with you defined by what happened in that room. Mom made her decision. Grandma made hers. Those were their choices, and I'm going to honor both by moving forward instead of staying here. James was quiet for a long time. Then he said, you are a better person than I would be in this situation. I said, I've had a lot of practice showing up. I plan to keep doing it. He laughed, a small, real laugh. He said, I know you do. I said, come for Christmas this year. Not just a day. Stay a week. He said, yeah, okay, I will. My grandmother saw me. That is the sentence I keep coming back to. Not my mother, who loved me the way people love someone they assume will always be fine regardless. My grandmother, who wrote a letter in 1989, put it in a folder with a trust document, and waited 34 years for the right moment to arrive. She watched me every Tuesday, every Thursday, every time I showed up without being asked. She did not have the words when she was alive. She found them when it mattered. I have that letter in a frame on my bedroom wall. I read it sometimes when I need to remember that being seen, even once, even by one person, even across 34 years, is enough. It is more than enough. It is everything. Tell me in the comments, what would you have done with that trust? Kept it or split it? And has anyone in your life ever seen you the way Sarah's grandmother saw her? Subscribe. New story every week. Every single one earns its ending.